All right. Good afternoon, I guess it is now. This is going to be the lecture over plant reproduction, the one that we will be covering on October the 9th. So when I see you, we will be covering this in person, but this is just kind of a quick prelude to what awaits you. So we will be kind of discussing the plant reproduction, and with that, the flowers are the reproductive organs of plants. Hopefully, we can find some to look at in lab tonight. If not, we may have to go out on a scavenger hunt on campus. I'm sure we can find some there, but we will take a look at some of them in person tonight so we can see some of them. But the flowers are those reproductive organs of them. Whenever we're looking at the flower structure, this is something that's kind of important to you. So just kind of take a look at this slide for a little bit, but we have the anther, the filament. We obviously have the petals that go along with that, and that's on the left side, which is the stamen. Then on the other side, and by the way, the stamen is the male part of the plant. The carpel is on the female side, which is the stigma, the style, and then the ovary and the ovule, which is inside there. And then we have the receptacle and the peduncle underneath, the sepal and the petals, which kind of the petals serve as a protective coating for all of this. So again, everything on the left side, the stamen with the anther and the filament would be the male reproductive parts. On the right side, what we would consider the female, which is the carpel, which is the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. So whenever we look at some of these, you can click here and kind of show all of them. We will talk about them individually in class, so you won't really have to go through that, but you could actually click on each of these, and it kind of goes through some of them. It doesn't work that well, so never mind. So whenever we talk about the sexual reproductive strategies of plants have two stages. They're alternating life cycles. The diploid sporophyte is the dominant and produces the haploid spores by meiosis. If you remember last time we talked about diploid means the full number or double, or two sets, if you will. The haploid is half of that diploid number. Meiosis is the process that is the two stages that it goes through. It is this portion of the life cycle that bears the flower. So it's through that process of meiosis that the plant actually bears flowers. Flowering produces two types of spores, either microspores or megaspores. Pretty obvious what those two mean. Microspores are very, very small. The megaspores are the larger ones. The spores actually divide through a process of mitosis to get the haploid gametophytes. So mitosis is that first stage, remember, of interphase, and then prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase through that cytokinesis. We talked about how this works in plant cells, if you remember, because plant cells are going to get that cell plate and that cell wall. The gametes, the gametophytes would produce the gametes then. The gametes fuse to produce the diploid zygote. So the zygote is then going to what is then going to go through mitosis to become the diploid sporophyte, which becomes a mature organism. All this is through the flowering process. So whenever we look at it, here is a good representation of what happens. So if we start here at number 1, we have the sporophyte, we have a full-fledged flower, and we have the anther, and then we have the ovary and the ovule. And so what we have is reproduction that's going to take place right here from the anther over into the ovary, and then we're going to get the meiosis to take place. So as we get that meiosis to take place, here's what's happening. We have a microspore coming from the anther, and we have a megaspore coming from the ovule. So if you want to think of them as the sperm and the egg, if that's easier for you to think about, but really what it is the pollen grain is the microspore coming from the male side, and the female gametophyte is the embryo sac, which is the megaspore coming from the other side. So what happens then is they do become the sperm and the egg. And as they do so, they fertilize, and as they fertilize, they become a zygote. And that zygote then becomes a seed. And that seed goes through mitosis and develops into a sporophyte. So that's kind of the process, kind of quick running around there. So we have the sporophyte, we have a flower, and that flower goes through the meiosis process first, which is the reproductive process. Then it goes through the mitosis process, which is the splitting of it to produce. So it's a little bit maybe different than what you had thought before, but just kind of pay attention to this so that you know the stages here. Then we're going to kind of take, we have this seed here, okay? We're going to go through what has to happen for this seed, okay? So we have our seed, and we have our seed coat, and we have everything that goes along with it. Sorry for the disruption. My coworkers don't help out sometimes. All right, so where were we? We had a seed. So we have the seed of our plant here, and we have inside the seed, we have the seed coat, we have our embryo, we have our endosperm, all inside the seed. And what happens then, that seed starts to develop, and out of that mitotic process, we end up with a flower. And that flower has full reproductive capabilities. The anther and the ovule are the two that we kind of focus on. The pollen, the anther, is created by this microspore out of the pollen sac. What happens here is the ovary or the ovule actually creates a megaspore. So then they both individually go through mitosis. So the microspore goes through mitosis and the megaspore goes through mitosis. And this is that splitting process that they're going through. The microspores develop into the male gametophytes or pollen grains. The megaspores develop into the embryo sac or the female gametophytes. So then what we have happen is these two go through this entire process, and we have all of the different parts through here, the tube cell, generative cell, pollen grain of the pollen grain, and we have then the polar nuclei, the egg cell, and everything in the embryo sac on this side. So what we then have happen is this is our pollen tube that we see right here. The ovary is where the egg is being formed here, and in the anther, or in these pollen sacs, up here is where the process of the male gametophyte or the pollen is being created. So then what has to happen is the pollen that is created comes up and enters in the pollen tube. And the pollen tube is right here in the process. So you can see it enters into the pollen tube. And notice some things here. Notice how the anther is actually taller than the pollen tube. That is by design so that plants can self-pollinate. So it enters then, the sperm will come down through the pollen tube, and it is now a mature male gametophyte into the tube, and it will enter down through the tube into the egg, and we will get a fertilization that takes place. Once it is fertilized, it now develops a fully functional seed containing an embryonic sporophyte and an endosperm. So this is just a cycle that continues to occur. So let's look at pollination and some of the things that happen. So the pollen grain contains the male gamete. So during pollination, this is the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. So from the anther to the stigma, okay? This is an example of cross-pollination that takes place. So cross-pollination is when the pollen travels from one flower to another, okay? This is desirable because it keeps up the genetic diversity and promotes variation among the plants. So we have the pollination that's occurring from the pollen to another stigma on a different plant. Okay, it could occur, this would be self-pollination if it occurred here. But notice how the stigma on this plant is closed. So it cannot attach, so it cannot accept, it has to move to another plant for that. Okay, so pollen can be carried between flowers by insects or by wind. Sometimes it is done by us in pollination experiments as well. But insect-pollinated flowers are adapted to attract the insects to them, And this enables the transfer of pollen, as pollen has barbs and hooks onto the insect furs. So you can see the pollen looks right here. It kind of has spikes that attaches onto the legs of the insects or whatever, but also the flowers, or in this case, the pollen is actually brighter colored. So that you may see that the anthers are actually bright colored inside some of the plants, if we can find some to look at. Also, the brightly colored petals are there to attract the insects. The sticky stigma then will collect the pollen a little bit later. You can see that in the middle. We'll look at that. So what happens is the stigma here is kind of sticky. So it was attached to the insect, and the insect may rub it off onto the stigma where it gets collected so that it can fertilize. Wind-pollinated flowers are a little bit different. Their structure is something different. They don't have the attractant of insects, but they need to be exposed to the wind. So notice the petals are often small on some of these that are carried by wind. Pollen grains are going to be very small and very light, and they're going to be in much larger numbers. Notice here that the anther is up and exposed to the wind. The stigma tend to be kind of feathery, kind of wispy here, almost looks like a Velcro-like structure. That's so that when the wind and it blows the pollen, it can attract it. And again, there's no scent or nectary or anything with these, with some of these pollen grains and things like this. And notice the petals are small because they don't have to attract the insects because the wind is doing the work here. Self-pollination occurs when the pollen falls from the anther onto the stigma of the same flower. Self-pollination does not promote variation, so it is not as desirable. So you can see here's how it goes, and it has to be carried up and in. A lot of times this is in an enclosed environment with the petals kind of forming around the plant. So flowers sometimes will prevent self-pollination by either having the stigma above the stamen, so you can see here the stigma is quite a ways above the stamen, or the stigma and stamen mature at different times. So here we can see that the stigma is not matured where it is over here. So once the stigma matures, the stamen are then no longer viable. So when you have a viable stamen, you release the pollen to come over and cross-pollinate into a different stigma. So this promotes cross-pollination. So we then have fertilization with fruit development. So some plants actually produce fruit, and that seed is inside those fruits. So let's look at how this happens. So once pollination occurs, a tube grows from the pollen, and the grain will go down through the style into the ovule. And notice here the petals are just not shown. There might be petals in here and more than just what we have here for the sepal, but there would be petals on there. All right, so this is through then the stigma and the style, or the carpel, the female reproductive part. So the pollen goes in, travels down through, as you see it going down through, around, and into one of the ovules. All right? The fertilization occurs when the male gamete fuses with the ovule, right here. So once they fuse, that's when fertilization occurs. So now you can see the fertilization is going to occur. All right? Some plants have the ability for seed dispersal. So we can see here the lovely dreaded dandelion. This is what happens after it goes through the process and we have the seeds left there. These will be distributed by the wind, and as they get distributed, you will have that process going through meiosis and then mitosis again. So let's talk about after fertilization, what happens. After fertilization, the petals, the stamen, and the sepals all fall off. The ovule turns into a seed at that point. The fertilized egg inside develops into an embryo plant. So this is something that you will be asked to identify on the exam, I'm telling you now. So notice the testa is the seed coat. The micropyle is a hole that was made by the pollen tube. Remember when we showed it coming down to the plant and making the hole? Then we showed the pollen traveling down and in. So the cotyledon is a food storage mechanism inside here. The plumule is the embryo shoot, and the radical is the actual embryo root. So this will come out through here. This will be the root. This will come out, and this will be the shoot of the plant or the stem that goes above the ground. All right, so water leaves the seed and it dehydrates. It becomes dormant because the metabolic reactions stop the ovary and it develops and becomes a fruit. So here we see the fruit. The fleshy wall of the ovary, yes, you're eating an adapted ovary when you crunch into an apple. This is the adapted ovary of the fruit. It just grew out of it. The seed is what's actually dehydrated inside there. Water leaves the seed and goes out then. All right, so seeds need to be dispersed away from the parent material. So this can be done by wind, water, mechanical elements, or animals. So, example here, blackberries. Birds eat the blackberries, and then they distribute the seeds through flying over and droppings. We have some here. These are the wonderful whirly birds that you see every spring in your gutters, and wind will distribute them. So now let's look at the germination process and what takes place. The seed contains an embryo plant and cotyledons, or starch stores. All right, so water enters through the micropyle and activates enzymes inside. The water also softens the testa, or this outside here, that allows it to split. So now what we're having is we activated the enzyme, we get our root that's going to be activated, and our plumule that's going to get activated here. So then what happens is the plumule is going to head up. Enzymes are going to break down the starches into sugars, and the glucose is used for respiration. It provides it energy because we can't perform photosynthesis yet. We're not above the ground. The radical grows to absorb more water. Okay, so this is what happens. This is going to go above the ground. This is going to stay in the ground and absorb water. It still has starch stores in here to enable it to continue to have the energy it needs. So amylase is going to get secreted in this process, and that's going to activate. That's an enzyme that's going to activate more growth. All right, the starch gets created and turned into a sugar, and it gets absorbed, and the seed is germinated now. So this is what starts to happen. Germination takes place, and this is going to typically happen as it warms up or the conditions become correct. You can see the root comes out first. The plumule starts to come up, the roots continue to develop, the plumule continues to develop, and it then will come up here and start to photosynthesize its own food at this point. And now all that the root system will do is take in water. Notice the seed is pretty much dried up at this point because it's used all the nutrients, the starches that were stored there, and it's going to now need photosynthesis in order to get the sugars that it needs to grow to create the glucose. So when we look at the dry mass of the seed, notice that we have quite a bit of dry mass in here. Then that moisture starts to get used. So the solid matter and with all the water will start to get removed. Seed loses weight, if you will, here as it uses up the starch stores and the cotyledons. They can't photosynthesize yet, but it's using up all of its nutrients inside. Then, as the photosynthesis begins, the plant will start to grow, and its essentially carbon content back in here, its sugars and things, will increase again as the plant grows. That's all we have for today. I look forward to seeing you this evening.